biblically. Many people who are Bible-believing folks are bleak. They have the bleakest view. There is nothing to be built. There is nothing to be fixed. There is nothing to be reformed. And that's because they are waiting for the Lord Jesus to come back. They are following the theories of J.N. Darby, whose works became very influential in the 1830s, and who changed, who might say unhinged the Reformation. He took the Reformation off of its progressive theory, the theory of progress. Modern progressives borrow from Christianity, and they even borrow the word progress from Christianity. But Christianity envisions an improvement in the lot of mankind century by century over time. And it does that by having a magnificent legal system, a magnificent judicial ethic in its law. The law, of course, in the Bible, summarized by the Ten Commandments, applies to the individual and also to the king. It applies to the government of the whole, the collective, and to the government of the individual. And my question is, how can we take advantage of this belief that is taught everywhere in the scriptures about the conquest in the end of grace over force? Take advantage of that here in Chattanooga and help things along over time, and give a better city in which our children can live than the one that we have now. And that's what we want. And that even people who aren't Christians want progress, right? They want progress. They want an improvement. Even Michael Gilliland from Chattanooga United for Action is, even though he's largely a humanist in his efforts, even he wants that. He has a concern about working people, concern about how working people are being deprived. Chattanooga United for Action, I think it's called. Action verbs, perhaps. But even he wants these things, even though he's just a progressive and believes that in political solutions to most things, by what I understand of Michael Gilliland of Chattanooga United for Action. Even he has this idea that things need to be better, that there needs to be more grace, more wealth, more unity among people, less aggression, less poverty, less hostility, less abuse, right? So even people who aren't, I'm not saying anything about him, but even people who have no Christian beliefs at all want those things. Now, the dispute is perhaps among Christians, and then between Christians and the pagan world, is how do we get to that state of improvement? How do we have more recognition of rights, more respect, better marriages, more children, and more people? Right? How do we have all these things that are the fruits of the gospel, fruits of hope? Right? If you have hope, you have children. Right? If you have no hope, well, you're not going to have children. You don't want to bring boys and girls into the world which is near the end of its rope. Right? And we're having now to circle the wagons, get our last crate of MREs together, throw the last bullet into the chamber, circle up, and wait for the last charge in our annihilation. That's kind of what many people are doing, theologically anyway, and are the gloomiest bunch. You could call them pessimillennialists in their thinking. But Christianity does not hold that view, does not authorize that view, and I'm not saying it's an unauthorized view. Sad to say, though, the majority opinion here in Chattanooga. So how do we have a positive view of the future, and how do we work toward it? And what does it look like? What is the shape of this view in practice? And my rubric on the David Tulis Show, that's me, David Tulis. Thanks for joining us. My rubric is more grace and less force. And it's a very short phrase, and it's encompassed in the idea of local economy and the free markets, right? Local control, local events, a decentralized social order, a decentralized political order, a decentralized economic order as well, where you have very few relationships where it's vertical, right? You have more and more relationships that are horizontal in nature, and that's the free market, and less that are vertical. What we have today largely is verticality. There's a lot of verticality in society, and there's much up and down use of up and down relationships. Those are forced relationships where I compel you to accept my bad debt. I compel you to accept policing. I compel you to accept welfare benefits and discouragement. I compel you to accept public schools. These are all the vertical relationships that we have in our society. And again, the picture is on the back of your $1 Federal Reserve note, the pyramid with the eye on top. That's what we have today. And that's because we're under a judgment, right? Societies that are under judgment have that form, whether they are Marxist or Democrat socialist, as in the Weimar Republic and the control of Hitler's party, whether in China or whether in Romania under Ceausescu, the Soviet Union, or any of these noted tyrannies. It's always the same thing. It's always administrative. It's always highly legal. There are all kinds of rights and requirements and forms and procedures that control, and they're utterly impersonal. And yet in Chattanooga and Hamilton County, what I think we want to have is personal dealings, personal relationships, so that force is less and less likely and less attractive. The short form of the gospel, if you will, or the short form of the Christian social theory for Chattanooga is from judgment to redemption. That's the short history of mankind, from judgment to redemption. And history traces out how that work of progress, the work of grace through mankind is taking place. And there are notable improvements in man's lot overall. Solomon, with his magnificent law that all the kings of the earth came and heard about. They heard Solomon discuss God's law, and that changed many of the ancient empires. That created the whole idea of rule of law, the whole idea of an external moral standard. Christianity is not mystical at all. It is judicial and ethical in its nature. It's entirely judicial and ethical. There is no magic. There is no wishful thinking to make God do what you want. You can't control God at all. He is outside of human control. You just have to worship him, fear him, and love him. That's the Christian theory. And in the outworkings of that theory, as more people take part in it and believe in it, you have a redemption of society over time. That is the argument in the gospel. There is no increase. There's no end of the increase of his government, if you will, and you can see that working out. Now, one aspect of this that we want to just mention here on the David Tulis show at Nooga Radio is the exercise of grace in policing. We were talking with Sheriff Jim Hammond about a moment ago about some of these questions, and my analysis after hearing him talk about his office and his duty is that Chattanooga has many things in favor of it, particularly in contrast to other parts of the country where you have violent police abuses, extraordinary police abuse. You have executions of people. You have causeless body cavity searches. You have black people shot down like animals. You have people picked up, tossed around like bags of trash. We don't have that as much here, and it is part of God's blessing on this part of the world. And I one linchpin to that progress, if you will, to that gain in life in Chattanooga, to the more generalizing of grace among the people in the city, in this county, is the fact that we don't kill babies as a matter of police protected state policy, allowing the baby killer to have free access to the women by marketing and free unimpeded access to his clinic door, clinic waiting room, and then the two stirrups there where the woman lies, her feet in the stirrup, and the investigation begins on how to take out that little boy or girl who's sleeping very comfortably this morning. And the nurse is looking at the doctor and seeing if he's sober, right? That's the kind of situation we have with baby killers. Men often hopped up on drugs, quivering in age, as one of the abortionists here in Chattanooga was an old man who came and destroyed boys and girls. Quite a few blacks, right? Quite a few blacks destroyed by this honky. Quite a few Mexican Americans as well, back in the 1990s and before. So that clinic was open 20 years and it's gone. And we are blessed for it. We are blessed for it. Now, the question I wanted to get to is the whole idea of de-escalation. I think if we have de-escalation as a theory, as a theme, what we're seeing in that, particularly on policing, is, again, more grace and more time. If you have patience, you don't have to draw a line in the sand. If you are a man who's been well trained, as Daniel Stevenson perhaps should have been in East Ridge, you would not, on August the 19th, last year have shot down plumber Todd Browning, a man who was not in his right mind. He was not in his right mind. In fact, he had threatened a group of people without having a weapon in his hand at a auto parts store in East Ridge just before. And so one officer confronted this man in his front yard. That was Daniel Stevenson. And if you watch at Nooganomics.com, watch the video. It's on YouTube. Watch the video with absolute horror and ask yourself, did that have to happen? The two men shouting at each other, Todd Browning screaming that he had wife and children. Clearly, he was not going to go and kill them, right? That was why, as one of the legal rationales for killing someone is that he might go and hurt somebody else. That was not what was in view, I don't think. But Daniel Stevenson shot him point blank 4 or 5 times with a military carbine, 223 caliber carbine, in what is an extrajudicial statutory permitted summary execution of someone who did not deserve the death penalty. That phrase is the condemning phrase. Again, it is extrajudicial statutorily permitted summary execution of a citizen who has not done anything worthy of capital punishment. But it's in the law. It's in the law that can be done by one group of people, one only, and that is the law enforcement officer. Now, de-escalation training that we've had in Hamilton County, Jim Hammond says, has gone on for 5 years. Well, let's just say that that's good, and you, my listener, should be aware of this. And this kind of question you have to ask on the campaign trail when these candidates, there's only one thus far, that's the incumbent, Jim Hammond. But we'll know who all will be in this race in February when they all have to make their declarations of intentions to run. The question is, what are you doing to bring grace into your job and reduce the prospect of the use of force? Now, Chuck Wexler is a police expert. He runs the police forum out of Washington, D.C. I think it's called the Police Executives Research Forum. I think that's the name. His name is Chuck Wexler. And in his report about the use of force, he has some remarkable data, and it's on the training levels of officers who are there to A, enforce the law, and B, to keep us safe. That's the word. Safety is the watchword today. We are the poorer for it, by the way. But in his recruit training hours spent on use of force topics, median values are given in a graphic in his report. Here's the breakdown. Okay, let's ask yourself, if an officer has training for death and destruction this much, and that's X, and then over here he has Y training on negotiation, what are we going to have more of? Well, I think we're going to have more use of firearms, more use of defensive tactics, and more use of force than we will treating, negotiating, chatting, and distracting. And those are the things that are part of de-escalation. So in his analysis, there are 58 hours given to firearms, 49 hours given to defensive tactics, 40 hours on law and legal issues regarding. No, I'm sorry. 24 hours training given on use of force scenario-based training. So those three figures, firearms, defensive tactics, and use of force scenario-based training, give you 131 hours on the proper use of death, right? The legal use of death to kill the person, control the person, beat the person, subdue the person, tase the person, gas the person, bind the person, even though he may be dying on the ground. You're going to handcuff him first. You're going to handcuff him before you even ask him how you're feeling with the 9mm slug in your gut. Well, how many hours are given to de-escalation? 8. Okay, so you got 8 hours versus 131 hours. That is more than 10 times the time given for death and destruction and self-protection than in treating and using the 4 main elements that Chuck Wexler discusses in his very detailed paper. By the way, it is a paper. I think you should read it. It's very important to read this document, and it's called the 30 Guiding Principles on the use of force, and it has the agenda, if you will, the agenda for reform here in Hamilton County and here in Chattanooga. And those three parts, or the four parts of reform are the use of time, space, cover, and de-escalation. And if the officer doesn't have to draw a line in the sand, if he can call for backup, if he can say, there's a killing just ahead here, and I'm going to turn away from the prospect of killing this man, though I'm sure I could get him angry enough and get him to point his weapon at me, or get him to raise that club he has or that pipe that he has in such a way as to justify my killing him, I think I can do that. I mean, an officer probably doesn't think that way, but he could. I mean, he could defensively think that, at what point can I be excusably aroused in my anger and self-defense to kill this man with my service weapon? And the officer, let's assume he doesn't want that to happen. Let's assume the best of every officer, and that he doesn't want that to happen. But with the training for use of force at 131 hours, and the training for de-escalation and treating and retreating, right, at 8, we've got progress to make here in Hamilton County. Now, I did not get from the sheriff what the hours are, and I do not have word from David Roddy, the chief of police in Chattanooga, with 500 officers out there patrolling and prowling for malefactors and people who are violating the statute, on how that is allocated there. We'll have to do some more. You, my listener, can certainly encourage me in this direction. But I think what we need to ask the candidates, and if you don't, I will. Okay, if you don't ask the candidates about these questions, I will. And I just want you to know that I don't want to preempt you, the listener, but you can do these things too. You can raise these questions, and it's better if you do it than me, because I act representatively. I would act as your representative, as your host, right? You are my listener, and I represent you. It's better if you not be represented, but that you present yourself to the candidate, and you ask these questions yourself. He needs to hear it from people like you, especially you, because you are the man who matters here, David Tulis, and the number is 800-8949, 800-8949. He needs to hear it from you, and he needs to say, he needs to hear the question of, have you read Chuck Wexler's paper? Because you can ask that question because you've read it. Okay, you have read it. If we have reform in this direction, in Chattanooga, in East Ridge, in Saudi Daisy, in Red Bank, the other incorporated towns that have their own police forces, then we are making progress. Now, I mentioned Saudi Daisy not because of a fault, but because it's incorporated. Saudi Daisy here in Hamilton County has a very good record. It is a very fine police department, and I think that there are the finest people in that department. I live in Saudi Daisy, and I've lived there 20 years. I have not had a single encounter that I would say is unjustified. Not a single one. I haven't been stopped. I haven't been harassed. Nothing like that has happened to me, though I've been in that city more than 20 years. And it's basically one drag through town, one main drag through Saudi Daisy. And those officers are not about to bother people who are just going to and from their business. They're not involved in that. They're not raking in revenue by running speed traps behind the church or the store. They're not doing that. And that is all to their credit. Because those kinds of things where you have a needless encounter with the law, those are the kind of things that make people angry and bitter. And I would say dispirited. I say dispirited because I think Americans, even here, we have a lot of that already. We have here a kind of dispiriting way because of the very fact that we have police departments. Even though, as I say earlier, there is a pacific and mildness, a pacific and mild way generally in the Hamilton County area. And so you, my listener, should count that as a blessing. Still, though, there's the problem of the very fact that we have policing, which is a time we'll have to discuss that another day. And I won't get into that now. But we have an interest in de-escalation. If there's de-escalation, there's less force, right? That works back into the whole gospel theory that we make men who are fallen want to do what's right and good. We give them improvements in their way of thinking. Look, you don't have to steal. Why don't you work? Why don't you work? Why don't you not steal from stores and steal from employers, but why don't you work? You're a very smart man. You're a very talented man. You have many gifts. And why are you stealing? Why are you doing that? You see, this is what we need to be doing. Why are you hitting that person? Why are you accusing that person? Why are you raising your voice at your children? You know, things like that all are in the direction of reform individually, which is what Christianity does for the individual soul. But that can happen in society at large. And that's what reform is all about. That's what de-escalation is all about. Less force, more treating. Treating is simply the word for treaty. Treaty comes from the word to treat. And to treat, you could say, is to entreat, right? To ask. That's what a treaty is. Let's ask. Let us have an asking of each other. And the question should be here in Chattanooga, in the marketplace, what can I do for you? That's a treaty. Let's make a treaty. So we have the civil magistrate. That would be the court. And in our county, the sheriff, of course, is the agent of the court. And if we're blessed over time, if we're blessed a couple hundred years out, government will be restored back to its original purpose by God. And that is to run the courts. And that's it. We don't need the government anymore. We don't need the civil magistrate, the welfare and warfare state. Government is retreated to its proper forum, its proper venue and jurisdiction. And that is to run the court, where the criminal is apprehended, convicted, and executed if it's a capital offense, and where they're not being in prison, all other offenses and crimes are dealt with by restitution. It's all about victims' rights. And that is the operation of the court. And there you have, again, the treating arrangement where the perpetrator makes good to the victim. And they negotiate how the compensation is to be made. It's all about victims' rights. The victim is first. The victim controls the punishment. The victim controls how he is to be restored, how he is to be made right after the tort or the crime. And the court oversees that. And even in that relationship, there's the treating, the pleading back and forth. Let's have a treating society in Hamilton County and Chattanooga where there's grace and peace exchanged. The gospel is not just about your private life. It's about the world at large. And Christianity has so much to say about it. And let's see if we can inject some of its opinion, if you will, into the sheriff's race here in Hamilton County. There'll be some challengers, no doubt. Jim Hammond is running. There's an event tonight at a hotel downtown as he's seeking funds to run for another term in office as sheriff. David Tulis, brought to you by Nooganomics.
Traffic, news, and information. Nooga Radio. Digital FM 95.3 HD4.